Hello, spiritual gangsters. Um, Today, I'm going to talk about linguistics of liberation. I tried to talk about this a few days ago, attempting to schedule a Substack live, and for some reason, I could not get it to work. So here we go. Hey, Mark, thanks for joining. Today, I want to invite you to be expansive in your understanding of how language works. If you read my most recent post, it's called The War of the Words. I basically put forth this notion that most of the battles that we fight in this world are basically a war of words. Humans are unique in our ability to articulate ourselves with language. But one of the things we do is we take words for granted. We take words to mean what we think they mean. And when we communicate to other people, we assume that they ascribe the same meaning to the words that we use. But if you've had a conversation with any person, you know that that's not true. How many times have you gotten into a conversation with someone from your own background, someone you love, someone you trust, and you get in an argument over how something sounded, a word you used, or something like that? Now, expand that to a larger scale, expand that globally, where you have people who use all sorts of different words, all sorts of different languages, all sorts of different expressions of value and ideals, and you put them all together and you get this mess that we're dealing with right now. Because there is no common language that people agree upon. Even when people use the same words, they use the words differently. And so, what I've been trying to communicate to people for decades now is that people can use the exact same words and be speaking a completely different language. For example, my kids have adopted some of the modern slang of these days, and I have to ask them all the time what they mean when they say certain things because the way they use words are different than the way I use words, and we live in the same household. And so I am trying to invite people to understand that language has a function. It's symbols. It's a tool, and it has no inherent meaning. Like no sound that you use to articulate yourself has inherent meaning. That meaning has been projected upon it, and it is an agreement with other people. It's a social contract that if you use this symbol in a certain way, then what you're trying to communicate is the same thing that I'm trying to communicate. But if you look at words like woke and DEI and all these other things, you see that people who think that they own the English language in particular, or any colonizing language, but English in particular, they think that they can redefine terms that people use to try to express or articulate their own liberation. And this is why I say to people that the language of the oppressor can never be used to articulate the liberation of the oppressed. It cannot. It can't. It won't. And until we learn that, we're going to keep continuing to fail at articulating our liberation. So what does that mean? Well, the language that exists, the language that people use usually is designed to express, yes, Mark, colonizing language, exactly. The language that we use expresses what we value. So now looking at English, what did they value when this language was thrust upon many of us? They valued our subjugation. And so their language articulated and justified the subjugation of people, the robbery of people, all sorts of things. And then when we adapted or adopted that language, then when we try to articulate something different than what they valued, it's difficult to do. And even when we are able to do it, the only thing they'll do is they'll say, no, you can't use that word this way. This is the way we want this word to be used. And now you're going to have to basically take the definition that we decided. So now you have these people saying, oh, the woke this and the woke that and the woke, because they're like, woke is our word. We'll use it the way we want to use it. We don't care how you use it because it was never designed to articulate your liberation. But if we understood that, those of us who are on the bottom end of this linguistic expression and these neuro-linguistic biases, we would then not use those social contracts in the same way. or we would come up with new words, artistic expressions, and other ways of articulating our liberation. But we can't do that if we don't come to those expressions from a place of liberation. That means you have to be liberated first. You cannot wait for to be able to articulate why you're worthy of liberation in the language of the folks who don't think you're worthy of liberation. You have to express that within yourself. You have to live that from within yourself and then create new ways of expressing yourself with the assumption that you are free, that it's not something that's happening in the future. It's not something that you have to earn. It's not something that someone can grant to you. It is your fundamental core essence and reality. You are liberated. Point blank, no effing waiting. This is how I show up in spaces because I know that no human being has the power to liberate me from anything. I come to spaces knowing that I belong, not because someone gave me permission to be somewhere, not because someone accepts me, but because the universe has already decided this person exists. And because I exist, everything in creation has already decided that I was worthy to be here. And no one else can take that away from me or you or any of us, even our oppressor type mentality folks who cannot oppress. I can't be oppressed. I'm just going to be honest with you. I can't be oppressed. Someone can put that energy towards me, but because they have no power to oppress me, I can't be oppressed. But I know that a lot of people can be oppressed because they try to use these word prisons to articulate their worth. I'm trying to encourage those of you who are willing to be a little bit more creative to start from liberation. Once you start from liberation, then you don't need permission. So whether they hear you or don't hear you, it doesn't matter. Then you create words, you use words like I've been talking about this screedianity and screedo and all this other stuff sounding like a crazy person, but I'm not a crazy person. I was a cryptographic linguist for a number of years. I know how language works. I know its limitations. I know its functions. And I know that if I try to use a word that already exists in the lexicon, then the folks who think they own the language will say, you can't use that word that way because we already own that word. Therefore, I created a new word that no one owns that I can just call it whatever I want. So then I define what the term means. I define what the word means. And then they can't go back and say, oh, well, let me come to the etymology of blah, blah, blah. They can't say anything because I can make the word up and then I can decide what it means. And then just like they can, I can project meaning onto it and I can exchange that meaning through the culture as a social currency and a contract that people who understand how that word is being used can then leverage that word for their own liberation, their own being able to locate themselves linguistically, because we have this habit of talking to ourselves and the limits of the language that we talk in our internal world limits how we express ourselves externally. So for me, English is I would say, second-ish language because I was raised with two languages at the same time when I was younger. One of my languages was a Creole language, Criollo from Cape Verde. And that language, like all creolized languages, are the most accessible aspects of a language and culture, all merged together in a flourishing way. And so the cool thing about a Creole is you can adapt all kinds of words and languages, like different things that you find value to, like I don't know if it's still a cool word to use, but when I was a kid, fish, which is something that is cool in Cape Verde because it's a island. If somebody said, is everything cool? They'd be like, tout fish? Is everything fish? And that's because they value fish. Fish was awesome. So you could use fish as cool, right? So any other words that they want to adapt into the lexicon, they can because the structure of a creolized language is very flexible. Um, English is, in theory, a creolized language, but because there's a lot of problems with American English because there's a insecurity embedded in American English because of their breaking off from the British Empire. So there's this interesting way that American English speakers use English because they try to use it the same way that the British use it. but it actually is a bastardized version. But every language has its core values and its structures that are basically controlled by whoever seems to be the ruling class. If you can get yourself around the notion that you have to use language the way that the oppressor folks use their language, at least internally. Like, I don't speak to myself in this language internally. This is an outward expression because I'm trying to navigate social relationships and things like that with other people. And so I do what I call listening through what people say instead of listening to what they say. Because a lot of times, because people take language for granted, they don't even know what they're talking about. They're just repeating linguistic patterns that they know that they should plug and play in certain circumstances. So many people will say the exact same thing no matter what situation they find themselves in, because they have established these neuro linguistic biases that tell them that this is the only way to express yourself in this context. So many people, unfortunately, cannot help themselves but say certain things. If you understand how language functions and don't think of it as having inherent meaning, then you can step back and say, okay, this person is like, if I'm going to back up and use an example in the Transformers series, there's this character named Bumblebee that does not have a voice box. So he can't talk, but he's a robot. But what he can do is play radio stations and music and different things that articulate what he's trying to say. So if somebody asks him a question, he's going to play some music that kind of expresses what he's trying to say. And then the person who wants to hear or wants to understand, they listen through that expression to get a sense of what he's trying to say. If we all did that, or more of us did that, we would have a lot less conflict with our language because we would be able to listen through. But because of the biases that we have and the assumption, basically using ourselves as a linguistic frame of reference, we think, okay, if this person used these words, they mean the same thing I mean if I use those words. If this person uses this tone of voice, they mean the same thing that I mean when I use that tone of voice. That's bull dookie. It's not true. But many of us, because of our biases and our egoic framework, we think it's true. And so we get into these arguments. What do you mean? What do you say? But if you listen through what the person's saying, you find out that a lot of times people just don't know another way to express themselves. They just plug and play linguistic frameworks, little clips. That's why people, when you watch people and they just repeat stuff that's off of fake news or whatever the case may be, it's because they don't know what to say. They just say, okay, someone said this, I must say this. And it's very, very complex, and it's all built around three core motivations that I've talked about before: wanting to belong, wanting to be loved, and wanting to be safe. And they use the language to kind of frame that. But most of the time, they're not conscious that they're doing it. So those of us who have the intention of listening through, of coming from a place of liberation and realizing that these folks they're not a threat to the core of who we are. And that is, I think, very difficult for us to understand, because many of us think that the core of who we are is our body and our identities that we attach ourselves to. It's not so. But at any rate, if you're having difficulty understanding that, spend some time in contemplation and meditation, and it will become more prevalent. That being said, if you're coming from a core essence of I belong, I'm loved, and I'm safe, then another person can't be a threat to you and to the reality of who you are. So therefore, you now have the capacity to listen through what they're saying, not just to what they're saying. A good example is what I call racist, non-racist language. So racist, non-racist language, I am an expert in that because I grew up in Virginia and Mississippi with a white, poor step family from the trailer parks. Many, many times they said things that if you heard it from the outside, you'd be like, what a racist mother flicker this is. And you would be like, what? And then they would be hurt that you would think of them as racist because they speak racist, non-racist English. And racist, non-racist English, this is a word that I'm making up. Hello? Racist, non-racist English is basically they don't have the language to articulate what they're trying to say. So they say a bunch of mess that just is approximations. So, for example, because my dad was an immigrant and my mom's Black American, but because my name is Pedro Senhoria Ramos Montero Silva, they were racist, but then they would try to not be racist, and they would say things to me like, okay, for example, I don't think of you as Black. That's a horrible thing to say. It's a horrible thing to say. But they would say, I don't think of you as Black because they had this idea of what Black is, whatever they got told, whatever they believed, whatever they were enculturated into. Now they have this experience of me that doesn't match. So now they're saying, I don't think of you as Black, meaning I have made this special dispensation for you that goes outside of the normative idea of what I think of when I think of Black. And then they want me to co-sign that because now they can both have their cake and eat it too, be racist and not be racist too. But with me, it never worked because then I would just ask questions like, what do you mean by that? Do you know that that sounds racist? Actually, blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, because many of us on the oppressed side are also limited by language too. And we have this core experience of ourselves that is bigger than all this bullshit, but we don't know how to articulate it. So we're trapped in the prison too. So then you get some like Uncle Ruckus, Stephen type house slave Black people, no offense to them, who then when they hear someone say, I don't think of you as Black, they take it as a compliment because they just want to be seen and felt and experienced as they are and not trapped in these constructs. So then when somebody tells them, I don't think of you as Black, they actually think that's a good thing. It's really just more BS. But because both people are incapable of articulating themselves in the core of from their core essence, and they're both trapped. They're both bound. Like the oppressor and the oppressed are both bound in this kind of system of like lack of fulfillment. So at any rate, they using that same jacked up language and being stuck in those little frameworks, they just go ahead and have that kind of exchange and they can deal with that. But then you get someone who doesn't use language that way that ends up showing up as a disruptor. So then like if they say it to me, then I say, hey, listen, blah, 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 you're a racist or you're using language in a racist way. Then they get their feelings hurt because that's not what they meant. And they truly didn't mean it. But it's the same thing. Like if a person makes a mistake and you correct them, that's loving. But people don't experience it that way because they also, from an egoic perspective, want to experience themselves as the worst thing on earth, a good person. I can't stand good people. And I know, I know that sounds kind of hilarious to say, but I can't stand good people because whatever people think is a good person is just an idea that they make up in their head. And they do everything from an egoic perspective to avoid being seen as a not good person. But that's why Jesus said, why do you call me good? No one's good but the creator, because whatever concept that we have of good is contingent upon a lot of things contextually. You know what I mean? Like a person who shoots people isn't seen as a good person unless you're in a war and you're trying to kill you. Then you want them to kill the other person. So now somebody killing somebody is a good person, and someone who wouldn't kill a person, it seems like a bad person because it's all framed in these like very contextual frameworks, right? So you can't chase this notion of being a good person because if you're trying to be a good person, you're probably a shitty person. And because it really depends on the moment. But if you have this script in your mind of this is what a good person does, and so I'm going to do what a good person does under every circumstance, and your idea of what a good person is something that has to ignore things that are actually happening in reality, then you're not going to be a good person. So, like, for example, a person says, well, a good person never argues, right? Let's just say that. That's stupid, but people think it. Now, you have somebody doing something ignorant and racist. I'm just using racist because I have a lot of experience with racism, right? Now, you might want to say something, but then you think a good person doesn't argue. So now you have this conflict. I don't want to say anything because then I'll seem like I'm not a good person. I guess I'll just keep my mouth shut. Guess what? Now you're a horrible person trying to be a good person. instead of just being a person that's responsive to the situation and is operating from a core essence of liberation. And when you operate from a core essence of liberation, you want liberation for all people. And so because you want liberation for all people, when you see injustice, you're going to speak because you want that jerk that's being an oppressor to also be liberated. So you will free them from their illusion of trying to have power over somebody. So it will liberate you. Like, for example, recently I was at a Safeway, local Safeway, went there to go to the bathroom with my kids, my youngest kid. And when I walked in, it was still 2 hours before the store closed. But the person there said that, hey, we're closed. Our bathroom is closed. And I thought that was strange, but I just said, okay, whatever. I'll just accept it. So I was about to walk out when I saw the manager running up, and the manager basically was holding his phone in his hand, and he said to these three young black guys, I'm going to call the police unless you leave the store. So then I'm like, okay, I'm intrigued. What's happening? So then the guys are like, why are you calling the police? All we want to do is buy some gift cards. And the guy says, the person who worked there, who called the manager, he says, hey, well, I think it's weird that all of y'all are buying gift cards. To which I then, not as a good person, according to some people's thoughts, I said, hey, why do you care what they buy? And I interjected into the conversation that I wasn't a part of because I saw something that didn't make sense. And so if I was being a good person, talking soft and eating broccoli and drinking kombucha, I would have just ignored it and been a soft talker and just been like, oh no. But I didn't. I said, hey, man, why do you care what they buy? Then the guy said, well, it's just weird that all three of them are buying gift cards. And I was like, okay, well, it's none of your business. And then, then the manager said he had the right to refuse their business and that he was going to call the police. And then I told it to him, you better not call the police or I'm going to bring trouble on you like you won't believe. And I had no idea what I was talking about when I said that in the moment. I was either going to joke him on a comics set when I go do stand-up comedy, or I was going to do a very lengthy Substack. That was pretty much what I meant, but he didn't know that. And I was wearing dress clothes, so I looked like, a lot of times if a black person is wearing regular dress clothes on a day that's not a Sunday, people start being like, I wonder what's up with that. So he just kind of paused, and then he was just like, "Rah," and then the guys were just like, okay, sir, thank you. And they said to me, they were like, thank you, sir. We know what this is. We see it all the time. We're just used to it. And they also said they're always going to win. And then I was like, no, you don't have to say that you're getting used to this. And my daughter was there, my 8-year-old daughter, who was very upset at this display and screamed, I just saw straight up racism. And that manager, yeah, he was just like, yeah, you get out of here, call the cops. And I told him again, you better not. And then we left. And I actually wrote to them to tell them this happened. I contacted their corporate. They didn't respond. So I wrote a negative Google review about them today. But a lot of people will say a good person wouldn't do that. A good person would just sit there and be like, or whatever it is that fake good people do. But a good person, like I said, there's no such thing as a good person. There's just people who respond well or don't respond well to situations. But that person, if they're operating from liberation, if they're operating from a core essence of I belong, I'm loved, and I'm safe, they're going to play with language differently. They're going to show up differently. I leverage the language of telling this guy that I leveraged a bunch of stuff. I leveraged the fact that I was wearing a suit and tie. I leveraged the fact that I was like, I will bring trouble on you, and he didn't know what that meant. I leveraged a bunch of different things and used language constructively to try to keep those guys from having the cops call them, and I guess keep them from calling the cops on me too. But I leveraged it using language. But if I was trying to be a good person, or I was subscribing to a social thing that they're going to think I'm an angry black man or whatever the case may be, I wouldn't have done that. I would have just kept my mouth shut, and maybe those kids would have had the police call on them. Who knows? The point is, when you're operating from a different paradigm where you don't need those contracts to determine who you are, your worth, and all those other things, then you're not bound by that, and you can use language differently. But if you find yourself stuck, or you find some people taking your words like the same thing they do for LGBTQ, for feminism, for everything, any person that this language hasn't been designed for, they're not going to let you use the language the way that you would try to use it to articulate yourself. So you got to get around it with creating new words, creating art, looking into your own heritage and finding language from your own heritage that articulates the deeper core essence and values of your ancestors. And even if you can't speak the whole language, you only can say a couple words, it's worth being able to unlock those parts of yourself that are trapped in a language and a self-talk that isn't designed for your liberation. So, blah, blah, blah. I said a bunch of stuff. The point here is we got to create a linguistics of liberation. We have to be able to continue to work at it. We have to continue to be able to listen through from a place of presence and power, because if we aren't, we're going to be reactive to people all the time. And then we have to get over this like double consciousness. W.B. Du Bois talked about double consciousness for Black folks, because Black folks both think of themselves as Black people, but also are always concerned about what white people think. Again, that's not a problem I have for whatever reasons. I guess because I lived with white people in my house, and so I just was like, they were just people. But a lot of folks are stuck in that, right? But it's not just Black people anymore. It's also white people. A lot of this backlash we're seeing in our society is because for a long time, white just meant standard. White just meant neutral. White didn't have a positive or negative attribute. And that's why what we call white people could be individuals. But now, through the course of history and all of the things that have been happening in our society, white has started to mean something. And when people say white, it doesn't sound positive anymore. It's not neutral. It's not like, well, whatever I want to be. Now, all of a sudden, white means oppressive. White means corny. White means this. And even white people will say, oh, that's so white. And they say that because it's starting to become a social contract of what it means to be white. And so now white people are learning what it feels like to be other than white, where their color and their nationality and all those things have supposedly some inherent meaning. Now that it's coming on white people, where they're starting to feel the pressure of their name or that attribution having some kind of supposed inherent meaning, there's a backlash to it. And now they're operating from a double consciousness where they're like, well, I don't want to be seen like a regular old white person, and the same thing's happening. Sucks for everyone. But those of us who can be spiritual gangsters enough to not let ourselves be bound by this and can navigate this, we can day by day both keep ourselves unlocked, but also have what Jesus called the keys to the kingdom, which is basically having your words and your actions match. Once we start to be able to get better at that and have an increased value in that, which we really don't have now, that's why we got mad hypocrites everywhere. But once we get past that, and some of us start to be able to really hold on to our integrity and use language a certain way and hold that standard and hold that line. Well, once more of us are capable of doing that, we will basically start to liberate others, as Marianne Williamson said in her Our Deepest Fear poem, was that like once we liberate ourselves, we also liberate others. And I think that's a pretty good place to end, especially since my battery's going to die. So thanks for spending time up here. I saw Marg KJ and Rob Stewart, I think I saw, and anyone else who watches this video later. I know that sometimes I say some interesting things that sound outside of the norm, and that's good because we have to break out of the norm. And there is definitely a method to my madness. So if you hear me saying screedo, screedianity, and all these other things, it's because I understand how language works, and I'm trying to give folks tools to play around with it. That's why I'm coming up with the lexicon and all this other stuff, because legitimately, if you try to use the language that they already think that they own, they're going to evict you from your consciousness, and you're not going to be able to do it. So be wise, be creative, be liberated, be blessed, and be awesome. Thanks for your time. Share this with other folks. I don't always say like and subscribe or share, whatever the case may be, but I definitely think you should. Not because I am saying some stuff that I think is of value, but not just that. It's because I value you. I value you, and I want you to value you just as much. And I would love other people to value themselves. And we have to learn how to do that. We don't have an awesome way of kind of valuing ourselves. And we are struggling right now as a society because our self-worth is in the tank. So everything I say, as long as I'm saying it, is for all people, even the assholes. I know it sounds crazy, but I still love those fools. I still love those fools. So I am trying to say things to help them uh, also. And I'm using language and leveraging it in certain ways because sometimes all people can hear is when they get cussed out or corrected, they reboot. So I'm just trying to reboot some MFs. Anyway, I love y'all. Love yourselves. Peace.